And with that, it is 1 o'clock. Welcome commission members, welcome members of the public and press. My name is Paul Caulfield. I'm pleased to be with you today for the TROC meeting. And I'll be pleased as well to share my screen. So at present, you should be seeing our opening screen. I would ask folks, if you're not speaking right now, to mute. I'm picking up a little bit of an echo right from the start here. So if you happen to have another device in the room with you or anything, sometimes that sets that off. Which reminds me that we will be recording today's session. I think you were notified of that as you came in, and we have a full agenda. It fills up a screen as well. So just to talk through real briefly our agenda, we'll talk objectives here from our commission chair on opening remarks, quick look at our schedule milestone. It keeps getting shorter as we get closer to our due date. And then we'll take a look at what the work groups have been indeed working on. And it has been a lot of work in this slightly delayed meeting, and look at their individual results toward some of the options that may be most viable. Today, one of our own, Larry Shiflett, will be providing a briefing for us on federal funding initiatives underway. A brief briefing, if that's not too redundant. We'll wrap it up with a meeting summary. I'll try to reserve 10 minutes for members of the public to speak. Members of the public also are reminded that they have input methods using the PA cast. And for those who can't do that and yet want to voice an opinion or a comment, at the very end, we'll give you the opportunity to chat with us. Just those of you who are connected only by telephone and can't otherwise submit your ideas. So today's objectives are to take a look at those work group evaluations of what's really out there in the way of revenue opportunities. Let's see how close or how far apart we are on our ideas there. We'll take a look with Keith's help, my co-facilitator, Keith Chase, at the final report structure, what it is to ultimately contain. And then with Larry's help, review the federal funding initiatives. With that, I didn't take too much time, Secretary Gramian and Commission Chair, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon and welcome to the 6th meeting of the Transportation Revenue Option Commission. Thank you all for the great work that's been happening in all 8 TROC work groups over the past couple of weeks. When we kicked off this commission, I shared my thoughts on how we can all support the work of this commission by educating ourselves, communicating with stakeholders, be open-minded and broad-minded, be creative and participate actively, and finally, think long-term, but be able to execute short-term solutions. The team at PennDOT also worked diligently to provide the commission members with information, education, and tools needed to work on this challenging assignment. By now, it's likely that most of you have had an opportunity to work with the revenue option calculator. Through that hands-on work, you may have gained an even greater understanding and appreciation of the challenges and choices before us. Your initial work evaluating the various revenue options is an important step toward framing our strategic proposal. The options could be a series of paradoxes. The options are not either or approaches, but a balanced one. It's about understanding them as and propositions. We need to be optimistic, but also realistic, developing options that would address our urgent needs to get us through these challenging times, with the ultimate goal of long-term sustainable and equitable transportation funding for our Commonwealth. So today, as Paul mentioned, most of our meeting will be devoted to hearing updates from the work groups, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Now, before we get started, the first order of business, as always, is to approve the minutes from our last meeting. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
This is Bob Schaefer. I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Bob. Do I have a second?
Dave Sanko will second.
Thank you very much, Dave. Is there any discussion? I hear none. Does anyone oppose to carry the motion? Thank you, everyone. Motion carries. Let's begin. Back to you, Paul.
Excellent. Thank you, Secretary Gramian. A look at our, as I said, compressed milestone review here. So as we move forward, here we are in June, and another meeting out there on June 24th, only 10 days away. We won't give you a big assignment for that meeting by any means. We know we did the last few times around. To project that out, July 14 and 28 have shaped up. It's a little bit of an offset from our usual Thursdays. We're backing it to Wednesdays, and it's going to allow us that way to have just that little bit of extra time to prepare a final report that is due to the governor at the very, very beginning of August. We don't even show that on our milestone review because that is the drop dead deadline. So that is our game plan. So with that, I'm going to ask Keith Chase to kick in here, talk a little bit about how the report outline is shaping up and some of the reasoning behind it. Keith.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. With such a compressed schedule, it's essential that we move on several parallel tracks. The most important parallel track we're already moving on. That's the work you're doing in the work groups to wrestle with the difficult question of the funding options and funding scenarios. Parallel to that track, we would like to begin supporting the commission in terms of putting together the pieces of the overall proposal. This is indeed very much draft, but to have a strategic proposal, we are recommending the strategy that we begin to work on several of the pieces of the final product in draft and almost wait to put in that final piece, the proposed Commonwealth Transportation Funding Strategy, when that is ready to go through the continued analysis and discussion over the next several weeks. With that being said, let me just highlight several sections, and this is very fluid. It's likely we'll continue to make improvements, particularly as we move forward and start the drafting process. The overall feature of this outline, and it is a revised outline, is to very quickly, after some basic introduction, to put the proposal out there. In a typical study, it may be more of a linear approach in which there is a lot of background and a lot of lead up before the proposal. We are envisioning that this proposal needs to present what it is attempting to accomplish early on. As a preface to that, there would be concise discussion of TROC, its purpose, the enormous challenge we face with the scale and the age of the system, and some treatment over where PennDOT has been over the years in terms of modernizing as an organization, and ironically, contrasting that with a funding system which is not modernized, but in fact is quite antiquated. Or we would segue with current funding challenges and their implications for the Commonwealth. The core of the report as it's being designed would be to lay out the proposal, starting with some guiding principles. And those guiding principles could be things like the broadened revenue base, keeping up with inflation, and even possible screening criteria that you began using in terms of making your selection of the proposed funding options. We would lay out the long-term strategy, which many of us think of now as the technology-based strategy of mileage-based user fees or equivalent, but make it entirely clear that we cannot wait on the long-term strategy, that there is the necessity, it is essential that we move on near and midterm solutions as well. With that, the other sections of the report, the proposal that we can begin working on, include looking at the proposal from the context of both the federal government, and you'll hear more from Larry about that, and local as well. Typically, there might be a section that would be called implementation. The executive order gives us broad latitude, the TROC broad latitude, to recommend a strategic proposal. Those are the key words. So we will work with you on text, on approaches, that are implementation oriented, that explain or propose how recommendations can move to reality. We believe that it's very important that the emphasis on near-term action must be stressed, so the conclusion envisions a call to action and making the case that this cannot be a shelf sitter, that there needs to be near-term action, there needs to be movement, otherwise the consequences will cost more in the long run. With that, we also are looking at a storyline to make sure that this is compelling, and we'll take a look at that. This is an initial cut, a storyline. It almost serves as an audit for ourselves, that when the proposal is coming together, has it also achieved or accomplished the storyline? So as it's presently drafted and subject to further enhancement, we would ensure that the storyline relates this work to the daily life and future prosperity of Pennsylvanians who rely on this vast multimodal transportation system. A recognition that, like any other asset, it is aging and it's a critical asset to our economy, our quality of life. And at this point in time, it does require substantial investment. And yet we find ourselves at this crossroads where the funding mechanisms are antiquated, as I alluded to earlier. They need to be modernized as well, particularly the liquid fuels tax, not keeping up with the current mix, the fleet, the future fleet, et cetera. The storyline would continue, and this is not linear either. These are our points we want to make sure come out clearly, that PennDOT has made advances in modernization, efficiency, and there has been sensible legislation that's laid out that brings a solid foundation to address this still widening funding gap. Other portions of the general storyline, and we will look for ways to get your input starting today and beyond on this, is to explain why Governor Wolf established the TROC, that it was essential, it was necessary to examine revenue options and propose these key words: a strategic, comprehensive Commonwealth transportation funding scenario. May I repeat, because we often fall into the habit of talking about studies and recommendations. We are charged with proposing a strategic, comprehensive Commonwealth transportation, and you can read multimodal into that funding scenario. The storyline continues by telling the story that the TROC does represent a very wide cross-section of Pennsylvania leadership. In fact, the ideal group to put together such a proposal, and how you have organized into work groups to evaluate all feasible revenue options. Further, but all right, that the storyline continue recognizing that the funding scenario does address defined needs across modes of transportation, and at the same time positioning Pennsylvania strategically to leverage future advances that are coming in technology that are going to really represent the ultimate and the long-term solutions.
Thank you, Keith. There's your final wrap there.
I think the final wrap is this, and it's a tendency I think each of us maybe falls into, that being good stewards, we often look at the cost associated with the transportation as costs, and we need to do that as stewards. But there come times of investment, and this will be one of those times where investment must be made. I look back to what was done in the 50s when the bold action of an interstate highway system was undertaken. That was bold, and it was extremely big dollars for the time, but it was the right thing to do as stewards and as leaders, and we see that as part of the storyline here as well. Paul, I think I would wrap up by saying we will look for convenient ways to continue to include the TROC members in looking at the proposal as it unfolds, to be on that track of bringing together the overall product while working with the nitty-gritty details of the revenue options. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Yeah, I was, someone was able to annotate my screen, so I was trying to remove those couple of blue lines you may be seeing now, but I can't find a way to do that. But I may work on that in the background. Keith, I wouldn't have been so choppy. We received the work group's revenue projections, and not all work groups were dealing directly with those projections. So I want to let you know up front, MBUF really had its hands full looking at that long-term proposition. So we were not looking as much for a numerical submission from the MBUF group. Similarly, with the PSP funding at the other end of the time scale, so much is going on with that right this moment, even in terms of the budget cycle we're engaged in presently as the Commonwealth, that it is a bit premature to ask for the PSP funding group to kind of come down on one side or the other, what that number ought to be. That might be a bit artificial right now. Other groups submitted, for instance, on MBUF and as well on the PSP funding, and that information will be, of course, provided to those individual work groups. But just so you kind of understand the game plan here, what you see before you now, and it has a few extraneous lines, though there is no real significance to those lines, but this is a capture from 6 of the work groups, and those are named sometimes seemingly by revenue source, but it's because they were working on it, or by need, like multimodal. So this pulls together just some of the big picture categories of the revenue options: state police, fees, taxes, and other. We're not making a lot of these individual submissions. We're starting to try to formulate a view, a perspective of what the total funding recommendation package may look like. Similarly, as unfair as it may be to average those, we just thought it might be interesting to see how, when you put all that together, the pie chart comes out, how much of it's coming from taxes, ultimately, if any. Well, we'll find that out, but it was about a third, somewhere on the order of a quarter of it from other. We'll hear a lot about that in the presentations that follow. A big piece from fees, and of course the state police, the actual funding proposition. Staying with the big picture compiled results, we'd like to take a look at phases 1, 2, and 3, which each of the work groups worked on, and just give you an idea what was submitted by the work groups and its effect on the need. The need, of course, is represented in red below the line. The need may be as high as $9.3 billion, but this starts to put in perspective what the different groups thought might be what we could hit, reduce that need, and start to move up into the green with additional funding. We averaged the phase 1, which is that year 1 and 2 phase of time. We averaged the input from all the groups. They didn't get together and collaborate on that, but when we did that sort of mathematical exercise, it hit some $4 billion. You'll understand more of why the numbers are what they are when we hear from the groups. When we take that out to the average gap addressed in phase 2, some $4.8 billion. And out there where the big future lies ahead of us, and you see MBUF kicking in, and you have to keep in mind that at some point MBUF takes over and those other fees give way to MBUF. So I wouldn't put too much stock in this, but the average address gap happened to be some $9.3 billion, just truly by coincidence. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up the, just show you here for a second. I'm going to open up the Mentimeter. So we're going to put that back in the chat here, and I'll put that out to everyone. And you may have it already. But if you want to be prepared in case you want to put anything in, it's entirely up to you. There's the link for Mentimeter in chat. You'll note that I did not go back through the tutorial on Zoom. I thought we were all pretty much accustomed to that ecosystem from our last 5 meetings and maybe for our last year and a half. Okay. But in opening that up, as we turn our attention to mileage-based user fees, we're just going to have in the background that Mentimeter, not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I'm going to be pleased to turn it over to Ron Drenovich for your 3 slides, Ron, on the mileage-based user fees MBUF. So we're ready for you when you're ready for us, Ron.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Just to give some general perspective of what we're looking at here. While we're looking for $9.3 billion to meet unmet needs, our current funding for highways and bridges is about $4.6 billion a year from our gas tax in Pennsylvania, along with the federal part of that, which is another $1.9 billion. We wind up with $6.5 billion for highways and bridges, and then an additional 2.1 for other modes. So the total is 8.6 billion right now, but 6.5 of it is for highways and bridges. The role of this group is, from an MBUF standpoint, is not just to close that gap on the 9.3 billion required, but is also to put in place a mechanism that replaces the gas tax, which is already 4.6 billion. And just to give you a sense of what that means, if you looked at the data you have, a penny of gas tax yields about $1.2 billion. So in theory, we need about 4 cents in gas tax just to relieve the loss of a gas tax. So we need 4 cents a mile to relieve the gas tax. In addition, to get the other 9 is very substantial. And MBUF is probably, of all the opportunities to raise money, is probably the only one that has the potential to bring in enough dollars to cover the whole picture. So from MBUF standpoint, we're looking at more than just helping towards the 9.3 gap for the additional needs, but also to supplement the 4.6 billion that we already get from gas taxes in Pennsylvania. The MBUF dollars that would come in would be dedicated totally to highways and bridges. So the current 2.1 billion that goes to other modes and multimodal stuff would still come from other sources. On the 9.3 billion needs, there's also a 1.2 billion of that is in multimodal. So the real needs for highways and bridges is 8 million plus the existing 6.5 with Fed's involvement. The current liquid fuel revenues, well, I would say that both funding mechanisms would be in place during any transition period. We've already talked about the MBUF being a very long-term effort to pull it together, and we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. But both funding mechanisms would be in place because it would take time to transition out. It would take time to convert vehicles to be able to record the mileage that they've been traveled in different states, and all of the technology required to implement that. Very complex, very complicated, but certainly doable. We'll talk a little bit about what might need to happen for that to occur. Incidentally, if we were working on a MBUF operation of our vehicles, then you would not be playing in the gas tax area. So your gasoline would be less expensive by, in our case, 58 cents for a car in Pennsylvania. And we'll talk a little bit about the feds. Their 18 cents would also come out of that too. So while it sounds like we're only adding dollars in cost to try and close the $9.3 billion gap of future needs. Again, as I said, we go to the next slide here. 8.1 billion is for highways and bridges in the needs area, and on top of the 4.6 billion we already have by gas tax. So the total need is 12.7 billion in liquid fuels plus the need, and that 12.7 billion is what we would look at for a MBUF to cover. And it's going to take probably 10 years or more even to put that into place. We put a 2% inflation rate on that, and that raised that number up to 15.5 billion. That sounds like an almost impossible number to achieve. Now we do get 1.9 billion in federal dollars currently, and since much of this money for the proposed future development involves at 8.1 billion includes interstate repair and interstate upgrades, and of that 8.1 billion, it's interesting that 4 billion of that really is tied to interstate, and I don't think it's impractical or wrong to assume that or to expect that the feds will increase their participation in maintaining and upgrading the federal highway system, the interstate system, and the federal government is looking at MBUF as well. The implementation might begin at 3 or 4 cents a mile. A penny a mile brings in $1.2 billion a year. 4 cents makes us gets us to where our equal to where our current gas tax funds end up. Although we recognize that that's decreasing and deteriorating, and will continue to do so. We know that from the fact that more economical vehicles are out there, electric vehicles are out there. So that is generally eroding, and we can expect that to be even more so in the future. Let's go to the next slide. Our group believes that MBUF must be a very high priority and can coexist incidentally with the gas tax, and must for many years. It will take a number of years for this to transition over. The feds must be involved in it because they have interactions with all the states. In reality, the feds is more necessary for the feds to be involved in other states. If some states do not want to be involved, I think that can be accommodated. When you come right down to it, some states won't need what we need. Most other states, we're one of the highest gas tax states in the nation. Ohio, for example, is only 20 cents a gallon versus our 58. So they're funding their transportation, their highway work from other avenues. And if you were driven in Ohio, or if an Ohio person came here in Pennsylvania and was not part of a MBUF program, when they went stop for gas, they would pay our taxes on top of the gasoline. So it's complex, but I believe manageable. A pilot, if we're going to do this, the pilot needs to begin now. And a number of states in the Fed are looking into this. To give you a sense of where we are, the turnpike right now, on top of the gas tax, if you drive the turnpike in an automobile, the cost is about 2.6 cents a mile. So people driving the turnpike are not only paying the 4 cents for a car that gets 20 miles a gallon, not just paying the 4 cents a mile that our gas tax includes, but they're paying an additional 2.6. So if we were to put a 4 cent gas tax or mileage fee in place, we would equal our gas tax, and any increases on that would get us through achieving the additional 8.1 billion for additional needs. Not easy, but necessary. take a lot of legislative agreement and concurrence and creativity. And that's true both nationally and in the states. There probably is not any other avenues where these kinds of dollars can be found, unless we were to increase sales tax or something of that nature. And if that were to occur, then the general public would be paying for all the state's roadway and bridge improvements versus the users themselves. And anybody that drove through the state from outside would not be contributing to the needs here. A lot of considerations, but we believe that in the long term, it's a necessary solution to resolve our needs and get the additional dollars we need.
Thank you, Ron, and your work group. And just, we have a minute or two if we like. I had opened the Mentimeter, Ron, and the folks, we have 3 entries here. You can take a quick scan of that. Should be up on the screen now. And we don't have to address these always in the moment, but we do want to kind of keep this rolling. If anything there catches your attention, Ron, that you can address now, we have a few moments to do so.
Yeah, no, good comments. There's no question that a lot of education is going to have to be there. People are worried about am I revealing where I'm at? Well, if you got a cell phone, you've all revealed where you're at. But that's an abstract. Most people don't even think about that. But that's a pretty critical part. Doesn't have to be know exactly where you're at, but if you're out of state, it'll know and you can track it. But education, without a doubt, is going to be a long time to accept it. I expect EV owners will be more receptive to it. I think there's a consideration there in the first place that they understand that they're more receptive to the electronics and that sort of thing. Yeah, and the comment, yeah, the MBUF must be at least 4 cents a gallon just to break even from where we are right now. So every penny above that adds up 1.2 billion. Very true.
Yeah. So Ron, of course, we'll capture these. It's one of the reasons I like Mentimeter. We'll get these and be able to just bounce them over to your work group and really for everyone. But
yeah, there's a lot of good comments here. All true. Yeah.
Just in the interest of making sure we get to all the groups, that was excellent, Ron. I appreciate your hard work, and I'll get an A next time I write May on the slide there. I caught my own typo. But, it's not my federal government. The feds may help. So otherwise, I think we're in great shape. Thank you, Ron. That's going to take us to the tolling scenario. So I'm opening that on Mentimeter and then returning to those presentation topics that relate to tolling scenarios. We broke this up into a couple of phases, and we actually asked all work groups except the tolling group just to hold off on working on the tolling. These are big numbers. The implementation and the use of this in the spreadsheet got a little complicated, so we thought, well, let's keep the tolling focus group on it. So Leanne, are you my presenter this time again?
Well, yes, it's going to be myself, and Mark is standing by, Mark Compton, to make any comments, or if I forgot anything, he's going to be jumping in as well. So, and then I just want to thank Ron, so that everybody on the public side knows and understands. Ron had some great statistics and facts and figures that I think leads each one of these groups and kind of sets the stage. And of course, Keith did before we started, but Ron's explanation in the MBUF really helps to, as we all move along within our subcommittees and subgroups, it does set that stage. So thanks, Ron. And real quick, on the MBUF, just from our tolling scenarios group, we 100% agreed. It has to be a phase in and a phase out. A phase in of this mileage-based user fee between this and the gas tax. And then the gas tax needs to be phased out. we're definitely not going to be able to, flip a switch on one day and turn one off and turn one on. So I think that approach is going to take some time. And that's an investment literally an investment in the time that will take to get to that point. But so we wholeheartedly agreed with that. To look at the tolling, and we did focus on every one of the pieces of the tolling calculator. We looked at everything. We looked at, and you'll see a lot of the other groups have vehicle registration fees and multimodal type taxes, and we've even come up with some custom ones that we looked at. But our focus was really obviously on the tolling side because of being the tolling scenarios subcommittee. One of the things we talked about heavily in the tolling was that we broke each one down separately and talked about them independently. Then we took a look at them and said, well, does it really make sense? And here's an example. Does it make sense when you do corridor tolling to do some kind of managed lane? Or does it make sense with managed lanes, yet then you have congestion pricing? Or if you have a bridge that per se would have the user fee and the major bridge P3 program that's out, but yet you'd have congestion pricing. So, we did discuss the fact that these by themselves can be great ideas and thoughts and solutions, but they have to be managed appropriately, both for geography and who's using them when and where. So I just want to put that out to make sure people understand it's not just a toll this road or don't toll that. You really have to take a look at these projects and areas, especially in the geography area. So corridor tolling, that is when you take a corridor of a road highway, mainly these are obviously interstate, so it would be a highway, and you take that section and that section would be tolled. So we looked at this heavily and talked through how many areas in the state would you really have that opportunity to do that. So as you can see, what we've come up with here, we actually looked at it more of a medium implementation, but I would like it, to let people know what we're really looking for is that corridor tolling should be tied to the tip and the tip needs in that district. So if you're going to toll that road and area, we would expect and hope that PennDOT and that district in that particular area, it would be tied to the tip, and therefore those monies would be allocated appropriately.
So Leanne, just for a moment, for those who may be unfamiliar with that, is that saying effectively that which has already been prioritized on the transportation improvement plan is that which you would toll, so that you do get the return on investment because you had to address those needs for that particular corridor, whatever the facilities are?
Absolutely, and obviously as time goes on, that those needs can change depending on what happens. But that would be the start. That you would want to tie it to something in particular, not just a random corridor tolling and use it for whatever comes up.
Thanks.
So that was very important for us. We can move on. And you see that we skipped the major bridge P3 on the last slide, and part of that was really because there is something out there right now. There is the P3 major bridge program, so we felt that's out there, that already is in the discussion points, and so we wanted to kind of step away from that and look at the other options.
So again, Leanne, just so we understand, this is not to say you're saying zero. You just left that alone, kind of like we talked about the PSP funding for today. Okay, Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So the next thing would be managed lanes, which is really a limited lane. And these areas, some of you may know them more of kind of, we'll call them the HOV lanes, and maybe larger areas if you go or travel much in the highway, where there's specific areas, specific lanes in the highway that sometimes it's a matter of 3 people or 4 people. It promotes more carpooling and or transit. So people would be able to get to places faster. And drivers then kind of get that choice. They can go on the regular lanes of the highway, and it's not tolled, as in a corridor tolling, or they can utilize these, what we'll call express lanes or additional lanes that kind of cut through and allow for those people to continue to move forward. So we did look at that. We looked at it and gave it a medium implementation. We thought that, that could be something that could work out, but with a caveat that, that needs to be adjusted. The revenue would need to be, and it's not annual, so people wouldn't, have to wonder, well, how much does it cost this year and how much is it costing next year? The other issue we found is that there aren't that many places, again, similar to the corridor tolling, that you really could do that and have those type of express or HOV lanes. So we really thought that, could you have 2 5-mile sections or maybe 4 5-mile sections? I think once we got up to, is there enough to do maybe 6 in the state? We weren't 100% sure that there would be. So while that's an option, there aren't that many places geographically across the state that you could really do that full force. Congestion pricing, we opted to hold on that. We did discuss it, but we felt as though, again, as I mentioned when we first started out, if you're going to focus on corridor or managed lanes, or again, the P3 bridge, if any or a combination of those were to be in play, it might make it more difficult or confusing or even not really work very well to do a congestion pricing. So at this time we left that because we completed the others.
Leanne, as I pop this one up, just because I threw this at you at the last minute, our numbers just coming together earlier today. The other group, the group working on vehicle registration, another group, the one working on vehicle registration, we'll hear from next. They happen to coincide exactly with your recommendation here. That's why you see 2 bars. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. At this time, real quick, before I go into this, Mark, did you have anything additional you wanted to add?
Just a couple of things, Leanne, and you did a great job there. The congestion pricing, just so everyone's aware, we looked at that as if there was no new capacity added to that. So that was just tolling existing assets, not adding new lanes. What I would also tell you is that overall, we talked a lot about tolling statewide, meaning that if you could toll all interstates, this group was in favor of that. Understanding as we sit here today, we don't have the ability to do that without the help of the feds and without legislation. But if we could get that, that would be a key part of could be a key part of the strategy. Second thing I would tell you is we looked at corridors. The typical corridors that you have all heard about have come up. It's 81, it's 78, 95, 79, and 80. And I tell you that to say is you think about these roads being about 20 years ahead of the Turnpike Commission in age. That's about the same time the Turnpike started their rebuild, our rebuild back in 2000. So as you consider the rebuild of the interstates, we believe that in that rebuild, a mechanism of some sort of tolling, potentially corridor tolling, could play into that scenario as well.
Thank you, Mark.
So if you go into the next slide there, Paul, that you were looking at, we did, first and foremost, I just want to say how you can go to the next slide, Paul. We had great access to the PennDOT senior team who spent the entire time with us and were able to give us good insights. So we did latch onto this as part of one of our others. And in this really, this ties your registration to the price of your car. So Paul Caulfield, able-bodied facilitator, $100,000 Mercedes. His car is going to be taxed differently than Mark Compton's Dodge Caravan. So that's sort of how this works. The number we got at the 750 was the number that we got back from Kurt Myers that tells us that that's the annual component to basically the annual revenue that's received. So we saw this sort of as a phased approach as well. First year recapture what you'd switch to get to the 750 and then start to expand this as well. So.
Excellent. And that we dropped this slide in as a kind of almost a transition over to the group working on vehicle registration. Don't let the fact that it's presented under tolling scenarios throw you off, but that group brought it forward. Thank you so much.
And then one last component from us, Paul, that kind of comes back from from what our good friend Ron was saying. And that gets to the point of, really take a hard look at the vehicles on the electrical side now as perhaps a way to get into MBUF. So we also aligned around the fact that, getting that group in now to start a pilot on MBUF could really be a way to get us started in that space as we begin to expand. So I just, the great thing about what you're doing here is I think there's probably a lot more discussions that were similar and alike in all of our conversations from what we garnered from Chuck and those that were facilitating all these discussions and what are different. So.
And Mark and Leanne, I just popped up just so that we can take a quick look at what's coming in on the tolling scenarios. We don't have to process this all right now, but in case something catches your eye, it is up.
The congestion pricing there is to provide equity for less urbanized areas. That's come up too a lot as it relates to some of the turnpike pricing models too, as the old idea that it's 5 miles to get to the grocery store in Montgomery County, might be 40 to do so in Tioga. So that sort of speaks to some of those aspects too, that you could be looking at some zone type scenarios related to all this, and that's from MBUF, from tolling, and so that's a really good point.
Agreed.
Very good. Leanne and Mark, we thank you again. I'm going to advance the Mentimeter, and that will remind us that we're moving on to vehicle registration fees. And as I said, I kept up the ad valorem because that group addressed that as well. So who will be presenting this time from our group on vehicle registration? Oh, there's your pilot, by the way, Leanne.
Thank
phasing
you.
that in the way Ron talked about it. So
Yes, absolutely.
okay. All right. So vehicle registration fees. This is the 4 major categories of vehicle registration fees. The arrow is pointing out the purple line that dedicated group put in here. Quite a lot of range here on the vehicle registration fee. The reason that groups is at 0 is they came in with the ad valorem just covered, and we saw that number. So I dispel that mystery right from the start. I think beyond that, there's a pretty good convergence on the lease fee, and maybe at the other end, the vehicle rental fee, and something to be done about those TNCs, the transportation network, the Ubers, Lyfts of the world.
I believe Dan Hassel is supposed to present on this.
That might be a curveball to Secretary Hassel. I wouldn't be surprised if he could hit it, but he had his hands full with the revenue group. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't think this is me.
He had the taxes, Howard, as recently as this morning from 10 to 11. So he may paddle that one back toward you, Howard. I don't know. I can certainly present.
I'm on his team, so whatever he says, I agree with.
Okay. I can certainly work us through this until someone intercepts me. I think it's fairly straightforward. I thought the ad valorem was the big piece, and I thought that was really well covered by Leanne. So thank you. And they had the assist from Kurt Myers. This is what came in from the vehicle registration fees group, looking at, so they're at about $1 million. They're at about $1 million on the electric car fee. Quite a divergence in the data that came in on this one, on the electric car fee. Tolling scenarios just didn't deal with it. They didn't say it should be 0, I believe. But the taxing group came in at 2 million, as did multimodal. And then we're up to somewhere around 2.7 for the transit revenues and 3.5 for the local solutions. It looks pretty clear that something needs to be done there in terms of registration fees for electric cars. The exact number, and these are not money. This isn't money I can throw around, but it is not going to make or break the big difference in addressing need. The next piece on that, and this one actually gets to even a smaller scale, and these are on different slides because of the different scales, the aircraft registration fee. The group that looked at it, like another group, Local Solutions, said that's probably worth about $300,000. and only otherwise the multimodal group at 200,000 weighed in on this one. I believe this one indeed, Secretary Hassel. Let me just pop up the Mentimeter for a second. Good. We did get a couple of comments through Mentimeter on vehicle registration fees. And with that, I will advance that one so that we do open up on taxing revenues. And over to you, Secretary Hassel.
All right, thank you, Paul. So I wanted to make a couple of points about this. The group had trouble meeting until this morning, and we spent a couple of hours this morning and produced what I think of as a first draft of a recommendation. I'm hoping that we'll be able to meet again and refine what we have. But at a high level, we were leaning heavily on a source of revenue from tolling, and put into the spreadsheet the high option on corridor tolling sort of as a placeholder, knowing that there will be more work to be done to refine those numbers and exactly how that would be done. Vehicle registration, we also added at a high level. And that's partly because it's a phase 1 item. It could be done quickly. And on MBUF, we dropped in a medium fee, knowing again that that's a phase 3 item, but that in the long run, as has already been discussed here today, that can be phased up while the gas tax is phased down. That seems to me like a fruitful way to think about it. We did have a conversation about the vehicle sales tax and talked about a couple of options there. And although it's in the spreadsheet, and that's why the red line is at a high level in this chart, we didn't reach consensus about exactly how to treat that, partly because the current 6% sales tax that is general fund revenue, there was some feeling that should be pulled into the motor license fund, but then there was no agreement on backfilling the general fund revenue. That would be $1.4 billion to be lost from the general fund, and that is a concern to me in particular. And then we also were looking at a relatively high increase in the vehicle sales tax rate that would add new revenue of $1 billion. So again, I think we have to talk through those things some more in order to really come to grips with some different options. But without going into all the separate items, those are the high impact items that we discussed this morning.
Secretary, I just dropped in a couple of those individual ones just in case there's any color commentary here. You didn't address it. Here's what another group, the multimodal group, did weigh in on the corporate, personal, and real estate transfer taxes. Can you give us any sense of kind of what your group thought about, is it likely to get any traction going for corporate or personal income tax to address, this big need in front of us?
Sure. So the conversation in our group has really focused on finding revenue sources that are related to transportation, something that that looks and feels like some sort of user fee for people who are using our transportation system, and that's why there's nothing in our plan that represents these unrelated revenue sources. And that doesn't mean that one of these things couldn't be used to backfill the general fund if some of the current revenue sources that are related to transportation are moved to the motor license fund. But again, those are not things that we came to consensus around.
Sure. And then this one where clearly this is just keeping pace with inflation, if I understand it right. So this is in a headline executive order that says decrease reliance on the gas tax. This group still has to grapple with the fact that it is a $4 billion line item ultimately. It is very important. And in transition, it can't be neglected that we're really losing pace on top of the vehicle efficiency or electric vehicle phenomenon, because we have to at least keep up. Is that kind of the sense that you at least keep up with inflation at 2%? And that's what this represents?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay. And I think that's how the other groups read it, and they contributed accordingly. And then you did have a look, and I don't think any of the other groups, therefore you got a nice big wide column here, but as an other, the American Rescue Plan.
Oh, yeah. In order to, in order to secure some funding in the short term before some of these other things can really come to fruition, then we thought it would be worthwhile to look at pulling in some American Rescue Fund money. We, with the help of our representative from PennDOT, modified the spreadsheet to make this a one-time only source. So it occurs in 1 year with a $400 million infusion from available money now, but it does not recur in phases 2 and 3.
Excellent. And I think the last slide, again, these are just coming together here, but the last slide we popped up here for you was a 1.4 billion MVST. Can you explain that one to the group generally?
Yes, I mentioned this briefly earlier, but this represents all of the motor vehicle sales tax that is currently in the general fund outlook, and pulls all of that over to fund transportation. And together with the impact of fully funding the state police and the general fund, those two items together are $2 billion of benefit to the motor license fund, but lost revenue in the general fund. We did not really come together around a plan for whether this is a good idea or whether there's some way to backfill that revenue in the general fund. But this item did end up in our spreadsheet, and therefore it's reflected in the total that we submitted, which actually exceeds the target because this item is included in the spreadsheet, which wasn't really intended. But that was the
That's why your
conversation
line, your green line kind of jumped off there.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So this draws your attention to it. What's to be done about it? Obviously, that's a complex consideration, but it does make sure that we don't let that drop off our radar. So.
Paul, this is Howard Cohen.
Yes, Howard.
Dan did a great job of guiding our team, but there is a philosophical issue that I think the TROC at some point needs to wrestle with. And you might want to think of where and when and how it gets into the discussion. And that is whether the TROC can legitimately, given its charge, go to general revenue sources other than the state police, which we've had almost unanimous agreement on. And Secretary Hassel raises a very critical point, and that is, if we do take money that currently is going to the general revenue of the Commonwealth and used in the budget of the Commonwealth's General Assembly and Governor, or should we be restricted to transport-related revenue sources? And I think at some point, this needs to be discussed, other than in our team, where Dan did an important job of guiding us and moderating us, particularly me. But it is an important issue as to whether transport pays its own way or whether the general revenue sources can go to transportation and therefore leave holes in the general budget, the general revenue sources. The other question is one of modeling for the PennDOT team, and that is we've been almost married to this 2% inflation number. And that has been the lucky benefit of what the Fed has done over the past few years and the economy has done. But I am not so sure that we shouldn't take longer term projections on inflation from a reliable source. And instead of just using a 2% number as we project out to cover the longer term strategic issues with which we're supposed to deal, and whether we shouldn't use other than 2% numbers.
I appreciate that, Howard. Yeah, and indeed, if anyone else wants to weigh in, we certainly can afford a moment or two relative to that sort of philosophical, if not divide, at least question that Howard posed there. So you can certainly do so by Mentimeter, but time allows us now, if you want to unmute and discuss that at all. I mean, it is a bit of a trick in a virtual setting to come together.
Did I misstate anything from our discussion?
No, I don't think so, Howard. So these two items that we talked about that affect the general fund, the state police funding at 630 some million, and motor vehicle sales tax at about 1.4 together make up about $2 billion. If there's interest in backfilling that money in the general fund, that takes about 0.5% of the personal income tax to do that. And there's some in our group who felt strongly that that's beyond the beyond the charge of the T-Rock, and that we shouldn't go there. But on the other hand, I don't feel responsible saying that that we should just move revenue from one place to another, and it doesn't really solve the problem. So that is essentially the discussion that we had earlier today.
Excellent. Yeah, we just some ideas coming in, which we're all welcome to take a quick look at here. Talk a little bit about the CPI or properly indexing. Someone weighs in on some of it coming from the general fund.
One point up on the one about the CPI, and the department at PennDOT could provide these numbers, but I think expenditure costs have exceeded general inflation. I don't know why, but I'm sure there's a rational reason for it. And if we index revenue to CPI, we are going to build in a shortfall almost on an annual basis.
Thanks, Howard. Good. So we have definitely some work to do on trying to bring about that consensus. I will move us about to multimodal revenue sources, and these are revenue sources for multimodal that we're talking about here as we turn the corner here. So, and generally here, because you're not dealing with a revenue source per se, it's more of a qualitative presentation. So who may I have the pleasure of hearing from on the multimodal side?
So Paul, ordinarily it would be me, but one of the things that was pointed out, or I found during our multi-hour discussions that Keith and the PennDOT folks helped us with, is to coin a phrase from Keith, the robust committee that we have. And so what I asked was for Becky Bradley to lead in this summary here this morning. So we'll turn it over to Becky.
Hi, Becky.
Thank you very much, Bob. And I really do want to thank Keith and Nathan and the PennDOT team and the facilitators for making our meeting so successful and being so supportive of the work that we were able to do. So we really kind of started off with the philosophy of funding, essentially. And one of the key things that kept coming up is the real need for funding flexibility, especially as it relates to freight, and it relates to things like multimodal transportation in general. And so what does multimodal transportation mean? And it was really hard to take out a mode. Well, we know there's a transit working group. We know there's a folks working on freight, but really at the end of the day, we were concerned about the intersection, especially around freight, of different modes. Not a thing that I have on hasn't been on a ship in all likelihood, potentially in an airplane, in the case of high dollar value goods like earrings and jewelry and electronics and the like, and then is moved into a warehouse, usually via truck, maybe through a short line railroad or long haul railroad, then to our homes, often via box truck or some other sort of delivery vehicle. So we really talked about the language and how we needed to stop just referring to things like MBUF is being specifically for highway and bridge needs. That essentially the intersection of modes is critically important to overall mobility, especially getting to things like meeting safety goals, new performance measures and things for air quality, helping to address the results of climate change and other things. And so we looked at the fact that really the language has to be intentional in order for the legislature, local governments, county governments, other people that we need to be involved as key stakeholders in any implementation that's decided, to understand what the broader mission is. And sometimes that's a mixture of modes, whether it's transit, whether it's bike and ped, whether it's ADA improvements to make a project work, especially when you look at things like at-grade rail crossings for freight systems and the other components. A mix of modes is really the reality of our transportation system by and large. And so that we had to be intentional with the flexibility of funding in order to meet multimodal goals, which we really defined as basically all modes. So that really got into the need to be a little bit more strategic, not only in the language, but how the funding would be used. We had a lot of thoughts on MBUF, a lot of thoughts on MBUF. And so I'm going to try to follow the notes here. But again, our assumption was based on flexibility of modes. And then it was also a question of then how do you get to a successful MBUF in the long run? So if you're phasing out the gas tax and phasing in the MBUF, that would require great care in revenue estimation. And at what point do you potentially replace the vehicle registration fee as the MBUF phases in? How do you handle the logistics of that? And also there was a great collective prayer that the federal government would address this issue in short order. We also felt really strongly that the transportation funding solution requires some flexibility, not only for the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, but for our regions, whether they're a rural planning organization or a metropolitan planning organization, which then encompasses our municipal governments and our county governments as well. That became really important in the sales tax conversation in particular. Right now, counties have some flexibility for hotel taxes and other things to fund economic development, convention to visitors bureaus and the like. But if we were to be able to expand sales tax options as a measure of helping meet transportation funding needs, how would that then affect the project mix? What our metropolitan planning and rural planning organizations could actually do, which brought up the question of we've heard a lot about the unmet need by the department and a statewide need. well, we had a global question of, does that actually include all the regional needs and unmet needs from all of the metropolitan planning organization, a rural planning organization, long-range transportation plans and transportation improvement programs? Because if it doesn't, that means that we have a greater funding need than is been discussed to date. So I know there's going to be some follow-up on that, and in advance, that's very much appreciated. Did I have another slide, Paul?
You have a few more, yeah.
Okay.
This is the only other one, Becky, that has text, and then I just have the big picture, I think,
Oh,
of your numbers.
fantastic. Thank you, Paul. So again, it gets back to our more of our core themes and considerations. We really felt strongly related to the tolling conversation that there be some sort of strategic analysis and then plan developed for that. And hearing from this, the tolling working group, your discussion seems to be very much in line with what we were thinking about. I know it's never really the best idea to say, oh, Transportation Revenue Options Commission, your goal is to come up with a strategy. And then you suggest another study or another strategy. But in reality, in order for some of these options, whether it be tolling or other things to move forward, it's clear that there has to be more work done, but that there's significant thought, not only in our group on how that could happen, but it's clear from the other reports in other groups as well. So that is really fantastic. And that there be something that's a little bit more equitable in terms of tolling overall. One of the things that just came out globally in all of our conversations that kind of ran through the whole thing is a very intentional intentionality in whatever the options be, that they not adversely affect an urban community, a suburban community, or a rural community, that we had to have a selection of options that could translate across different geographies and different ways of living. For example, HOV lanes may work great in a location that has a lot of vehicle movements, maybe in a more highly suburbanized area or an urbanized area, should they have the space. But how much revenue you're going to generate in a rural area on those sorts of things. That's just one example. And then the group also had an overall concern for any of these options on low income and equity communities. So I believe, I did not cover aviation, and I apologize to Bob for that. But there was a conversation related to the jet fuel tax, and presumably that continued to flow to multimodal and aviation in particular. And if I didn't do that justice, Bob, I will turn the floor over to you, my friend.
Thank you. So all we were suggesting there is that it's under separate legislation, not under the road tax. But aviation has that ability to collect a 2-cent tax. It's been in place since the early 80s. If we were able to double that and make it 4 cents, we collect about 10 million today. That'd give us another 10 million. That'd be like a windfall for us. So we were suggesting that, given the proper context and sale, we thought we could maybe make that happen. One other thing I would like to mention is to give Becky credit where credit's due. She did have an outside the box idea, and I don't know that we've really heard any of those here today, but we looked at some of those other categories that were on there, and some were gambling, and the other one might have been the marijuana category. And I think it was Becky's thought that to tax the heck out of them. And if you look at, maybe not in that exact language, maybe a little bit different, but if you looked at that and thought about, look at what the lottery did for senior citizens years ago, what could marijuana do for transportation today? Just one of those outside of the box thoughts.
And I will show those at the end, Bob, because they were not in anybody's particular focus. But then I'll show the contributions from all the groups against that backdrop in just a few minutes.
Sorry, Paul.
You're nothing to be sorry about. I'm glad you brought it up.
I didn't mean to steal your thunder. I thought perhaps
none.
everybody else just never looked at it. We were unique, and I wanted to give credit to Becky for coming up with that idea.
Excellent. Yeah. Well done. And then I just put up your general numbers, Bob and Becky, for your work group. So, coming in at that sort of a shade under 5 billion, shade under 7 billion, And then again, I know that phase 3 is really a tough one to size up because of the impact of MBUF and maybe not retiring the other sources. So we're taking that one with a grain of salt, but indeed, that's kind of how your overall numbers looked. Well done. It was opened up during that time for input. So I'll invite you as well, Bob and Becky, to take a look at. Somebody's not as sanguine about the syntaxes out there on the right side, Becky, but you know, maybe with the proper promotion.
I think the one comment there, which is fantastic about DCED's multimodal program, we did generally discuss that. We didn't quite say it the way that the person put in the Mentimeter, but it was well observed that there's a lot of confusion around that program. And overall, there just needs to be dedicated funding to multimodal needs, was really kind of the overarching theme, which eventually got into the general discussion of flexibility in funds and making sure we aren't calling everything the highway or the bridge fund, because there's sidewalks on bridges sometimes.
And I think that question that just popped in kind of bears on that as well, Becky, that sort of, you know, to what extent is it dedicated? Is it focused, targeted column of money or stream of funding that goes to the mode? I'm taking it as a rhetorical question for the moment. I don't think anyone in the commission is going to, although if you want to come out strongly, we're okay with that as well as we get toward our deadline. So, well done, you two. We really appreciate that. I'll advance the Mentimeter to transit revenue sources, open that up. And our presentation here is transit because all your numbers, of course, were shown in the other presentations. We didn't really have any dedicated thunder for you, but similarly, here's kind of how your numbers came out for the multimodal revenue sources. So you perhaps have color commentary for us on that?
Sure, Paul. I'll go ahead and go first and welcome anyone else from the committee that would like to join in at the end. I did want to start by thanking Nate very much for a thoughtful and productive session with us, walking us through the screen. I apologize, my screen's gone blank.
Are you able to see my screen, Shauna?
Yes, I'm back. Thank you very much. So our time really together was more around the beginning of a dialogue around the higher philosophies and concepts regarding the approach to long-term known and sustainable funding for public transportation in the larger context of a transportation network for the Commonwealth. It was certainly, we didn't see the exercise as a one and done approach. So we spent a lot of time talking about common themes around fund sourcing and things of that nature. I'll briefly go into that. So we did cover, of course, the very important $450 million Turnpike Transit funding matter. And there was a good, robust conversation around that among the group. There was certainly, in terms of existing mechanisms that could be expanded upon, we talked about vehicle sales tax. There was some conversation around used vehicles versus new vehicles and some additional thoughts about that we dedicated to have follow-up conversations. We talked about vehicle lease and vehicle rentals, both is very important. Opportunities, vehicle registration, of course, and the tire tax. I will say the graph is not necessarily indicative of the philosophical conversation we had, but we also did get into a very good conversation around TNCs and how there should be a more robust responsibility from that sector of transportation partners, given their use of transportation assets and their impact on capacity within the network. Certainly then looking at EVs, we talked about much research and happenings on the national level in the last several months. Many state legislatures are looking at fees, enacting fees. While we understood within a larger context that might be a starting point for MBUF, there was certainly interest within our working group on EVs coming to the table in terms, again, of being that equity partner contributing to the provision of the transportation network, given their use of it. We then also had a good conversation around the importance of the federal government as a partner, the role of the reauthorization, what that looks like, and how that will impact all modes of transit in our larger network. I do want to point out as well, we had a good conversation around sales tax and local considerations for communities that may have ideas about what their needs are, again, and anything that is done on the statewide level around sales tax. It was just asked that we be mindful of local communities and considerations for what they might need. The conversation then turned similarly to rural needs and equity among the Commonwealth and some of these ideas. One example that came up was potentially a goods delivery model. For example, someone in a rural community potentially as a function of access may have to depend on that as a source of getting things more frequently than other people in more metropolitan areas. And so we had a good conversation around what does that look like in a larger system if that's going to come forward as a source of revenue. We did have some conversation as well about Uber Eats, where does that fit in a network, things of that nature. There'll be follow-up questions coming. But again, all very committed to the importance of both of those partners being an equitable partner in helping with the provision of transportation assets. Let's see.
And Sean, I just want to point out, I was a slide behind. I was lingering on multimodal. I have popped up the one from your group that followed it.
Right.
Looks a lot like it. It was not as high in the sort of green side here, realistically.
Yeah. Sure, maybe that will lend to what I've been saying about really the tool led us through a conversation and not the reverse. So it was a guide, it was something to have a good conversation around. It certainly wasn't seen by our group as an endpoint of assignment, but rather a tool to help facilitate a conversation. We did, along those lines, talk about some areas that we would save given our more robust conversation around things that were more directly transit related. And we decided we would have a future additional meeting and talk about some of the things that we didn't touch, such as MBUF, gas tax, all of the tolling situations. I know we were asked to defer and hold on that as it was. But other gambling also came up as something that we would like to have a future conversation around. And sales tax, there was the promise of future conversation around vehicle sales tax versus general sales tax. We did have a very good conversation about concerns within the taxing realm of something that, given the timing of COVID-19 and the Commonwealth's recovery and many things reopening, there was discussion around 3 areas. For example, the corporate income tax, real estate transfer tax, and personal income tax. Some members pointed out that there would need to be some consideration on any impacts that could have of the reemergence of the economy for the Commonwealth. So we will explore that more in the future as part of our continuing conversation. And then I think one thing that did yield itself very much throughout the conversation was the importance of a known and dedicated sources of funding for transit. And with that, I will pause a moment and see if anyone else on the work group would like to tag in and mention anything that I did not cover or any additions. Okay, with that, I will say that we will look forward to getting in a follow-up report and summation of our working group meeting, as well as scheduling a second meeting.
Oh, that's great, Shauna. We appreciate that. And, it is interesting to look at your numbers in phases 1, 2, but especially 3, because so many others, in adding that MBUF piece in, you see that green kind of leap up off the line. And as you just pointed out, Shauna, where you didn't, you kind of held off on that. I think it's actually kind of interesting to see that that very slow progression out in phase 3 in the absence of MBUF. Obviously, we could remove that from everybody else's projections as well, but just by happenstance, I think that's actually very telling, even if it wasn't intended. So thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I will say on MBUF, one other thing that we did talk about is there will be, of course, a larger conversation in the future needed around the cost, logistics, other considerations, and how is that factored into the context of the larger MBUF conversation.
Great. Two items came in through the Mentimeter, Shauna, and these are I know are on your mind as well. You know, what would it take for public transit fares to actually support you know, that mode, and that's obviously an age-old conundrum for that whole area. And then you know, just a note there, thanking you for considering that whole broad-based tax increase, the effect with the economy and recovery and so forth. So thank you very much.
Paul, that's very interesting in terms of you talk about some concept of public transit being more heavily subsidized than other forms or modes of transportation. I think ARTBA can certainly be a partner and a good resource. And I believe like early on in one of our first conversations, we talked about truly no source of transportation is self-sufficient. It is part of a public network and a larger public system. Not to take any more time from this group, but certainly all modes and all routes are dependent on being part of a larger transportation network.
I think that's a great observation, Shauna.
Sure.
Yep. Thank you. I'll advance Mentimeter to local solutions, which means we will advance to local solutions, the last of our work group presentations before we jump into a couple of those kind of other outliers. And here too, local solutions is really different, dealing with a completely different challenge. So I think Amy and Dave may be tag teaming this.
I think so. Thanks, Paul. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I apologize. We're having a big storm here. So if all of a sudden it goes dead on my end, Dave, you're on.
Got it.
He's ready.
I think that, you know, I can save a little bit of time. I don't think there's a whole lot different that we talked about than what others have, especially, you know, my friend and colleague, Becky and Bob from Multimodal. You know, we really, you know, we focused looking at all the different options, but we centered around a couple different themes. And the biggest one obviously was the MBUF, but we also certainly thought that needed to be tied to the congestion pricing, and they needed to kind of go hand in hand to get to that urban and rural conversation of the cost related to that. And it should be at least a minimum of what the average gas tax is that's collected annually, which was at roughly 4 cents a mile, if I remember the first presentation correctly. We also looked at the trip from the transportation network companies, the Ubers, the Lyfts, and so forth, and really looked at the first and last mile delivery charges. I mean, everyone shops these days online and shipping's free, but it really isn't when it comes to your local network and that first and last mile delivery. So we were looking at the excise tax for packages delivered, regardless of whether it was your favorite box store or it was the pizza delivery. You know, something needed to be there. And we obviously felt that the state police needed to be removed fully out of the motor license into the general fund. And there was an opportunity to do so, at least for the next 2 years, through the recovery monies that was mentioned in another presentation. All of those overarching themes we felt needed to be indexed to at least CPI, if not more. And then to get to what the crutch of our conversation was the local sales options. And I know Dave put this in the chat box, is all the conversations we're having about the shortfall and the gaps of transportation funding does not include local transportation systems. And they own roughly half the system, and we're not talking about them in this $9 billion shortfall. So we removed the gas tax, which is the mission of this, to phase out the gas tax. How do we backfill to local governments to support a system that we're not even talking about the gaps in what they need to maintain? It gets to, and I think it was Becky in the multimodal, is that there needs to be options at the local and county level and at the MPO and RPO level if you need to look at things on a regional network, to be able to generate local fees to help pay for the transportation system, whether that's a sales tax increase, whether that's, increasing the vehicle registration fee or the vehicle fees, the $5 fee, or whether it's something different like an extraction tax at the local level. There needs to be some way to generate resources locally to pay for half the infrastructure that the local governments are required to take care of. So how do we fill that gap and how do we do that? And we talked about a number of them, and trying to think bold and to really take this seriously as far as coming up with the revenue. One of the things that has struck me, and I'll go off a little bit and then ask Dave to fill in any of the gaps that I've missed in our conversation. But, we keep all the options that we look at are all based on people who own vehicles or operate vehicles to pay for our entire transportation system. And one could argue, and I think I certainly do argue, that everybody benefits from a transportation system, whether you own a vehicle or not. And we need to find a way to grow the pot of funding by not having people pay as much. And, again, we hear all the conversations about why does gas tax money get spent on XYZ, and you can fill in the blanks. And it's because it's eligible, but everybody should be paying into transportation to maintain, to have their products delivered. We saw during the pandemic that people needed toilet paper, it was being delivered and it wasn't costing them anything for shipping. And those people may not have a vehicle and may not be paying for gas, but yet it was delivered to them. So thinking boldly, is there an opportunity for us to have a national sales tax, a national infrastructure per capita fee that everybody pays into to help close the gap and to think differently, especially when it comes to that money getting down to the local level to maintain that mechanism that is going to get goods to market, people to work, and the delivery of those goods to each individual household. So that is the high level of where we were at. We recognize that some of the discussions regarding taxing was completely out of our lane when it came to personal income tax fees and things like that, but we recognize that's a legislative issue. Certainly we all had individual opinions, but stayed in our lane to only look at ways to fund transportation. So that is the high level from the local funding solutions. And I'll turn to Dave and the others to see if we missed anything.
Yeah, I'll put your cumulative numbers up here, Dave and Amy there, just kind of how your numbers played out.
I think as we approached it, we looked at we took the basis of the $8 to $9 billion shortfall and figured out how to fund it. And as you can see, as you look at, while we just prioritized the top three, if you look through our chart, you can almost say that geez, there was never a tax he didn't like. I mean, there was some allocation for every component. And even with that, and in middle of the road, you just can't get there without, and that doesn't even begin talking about the local costs. So as Becky and Amy talked about, the prospect of local communities, small communities aren't going to have a tax base. They're not going to be able to do this, no matter what some of those choices you give them, and they're going to have to be imposed at a larger, more regional level, whether that's county or at the state level, and there just has to be an allocation of that back towards the as someone said, 50% of the system, and that's I think a critical piece that you need to look at. And just as an aside, I think the local solutions, we got to come up with a different name, because we're really not talking about local solutions at all.
Hey, we're open to that, Dave. Yeah, by all means. It's global solutions, right? For all of us, I suppose.
And Paul, one of the things, just to make note, we did not look at any of the tolling options in any of our revenue analysis. So when you see the slides, options 1, 2, and 3 does not include any tolling whatsoever. But we had a lengthy conversation about tolling options, and it mirrors kind of what the tolling group discussed earlier.
Great. And we didn't talk about any cost saving opportunities as well, because those are I guess for a different day. But part of I think in some of our early meetings as a full commission, we talked about understanding what made up that $9 billion shortfall, and is it are all those expenditures tagged appropriately?
Let's see if anything came in that you folks might want to look at or respond to. Just time permits a few moments here to take a look at these ideas.
Paul, this isn't on any of those input boxes on your screen, but it seems to me there are two strategic issues that have gotten a lot of attention at the policy level. But I think someone in PennDOT or in the Revenue Department or a task force has to tell us or give us some indication of how we would actually manage and implement the MBUF. We put a lot of dollars on it over time. And I'm not so sure, we discussed this under the guidance of Dan Hassel, but I'm not so sure that we've paid enough attention to the actual management implementation of an MBUF. And there are serious privacy issues, et cetera, that pop up to that. And the other issue is, while the governor's statement may have mentioned the phase out of the gasoline tax, or the fuels tax, as I prefer to call it, that's not going to happen even over the next 10 years because the fleet doesn't turn over that fast, even with the acceleration of electric vehicles. So we need a little bit of a projection from somewhere as to what the fleet turnover would be, what the decline would be in gas tax collections at any level of that we now have or have proposed to increase. Because if we're looking at 10 years as the time horizon for phase 3, then there are two major issues. One is MBUF. I mean, to me, there's the philosophical issue that either Ms. Kessler or Ms. Russell raised, but there are the philosophical issue of whether transport pays for itself or gets money injected from general revenues. And Dan Hassel has very clear views and thoughts on that. But MBUF, to implement it, and the decline of the gas tax, it's not going to be eliminated over the time frame we're charged with looking at. And someone ought to give us some sense of numbers about that.
Is what what that sort of uptake level is and what's going to decline. Thank you, Howard. Excellent point. And it doesn't have to be in here. We still caught what you said. So with that, I'm going to advance us. I'm just going to put up the Menti on the other solutions. We'll cover these quickly as groups went through this, as Bob Schaefer pointed out earlier. So multimodal vehicle registration fee work group and the tolling scenarios work group each put something in on, is there an opportunity to capitalize on a recreational marijuana sort of windfall, if you will, to a tune of $500 million for the multimodal folks and $300 million for the other two. So I'm just going to put this up here for you to give some thought to. You can put thoughts in Mentimeter, but I do want to make sure we have some time for Larry's presentation on federal initiatives briefly. Next piece up was that of gambling. Aforementioned, Bob, there's the multimodal folks at $500 million there, and 300 million came in from those looking at vehicle registration fees. So obviously interesting potential line items, possible outliers as well, whether they could be dedicated to transportation, but this group is ambitious and wide-eyed about what might happen. There was even some submission from the local solutions folks, the vehicle registration fees, and the group that worked on taxing and other revenues, all a common number. So I guess this was just a plug number of 170 million. This did not come from the tolling group, mind you. We kept them focused only on tolling. I don't know if anyone from one of those three groups wants to offer the rationale for this particular line item. For the local vehicle or the taxing group. If you recall, I know we've been throwing a lot of numbers around.
I think on the chart, it was the only option. It was a full redirection of the motor license funds to the turnpike being put back into the motor license fund. So I think that's why everybody probably
That's
settled
why
around
it's
that
that
single
number,
number.
Dave. Okay. Yeah. So don't know the realisticness, if you will, of that, but that was just something that the groups kind of ticked the box on. Okay. So what we have to do is work toward consensus. I've heard enough groups say that they were willing to go back, refine some thoughts. Now that you've seen, and you just saw it today, all of the information coming in from all the groups, that will undoubtedly shape your considerations for the future. So we'll kind of spin back to you. I don't think it'll be a heavy lift, more of a refinement next time around. I want to make sure we have time for our presentation. So next up is Larry Shiflett. He is our Deputy Secretary for Planning. So Larry, I'm ready when you are.
All right, Paul, you can get rid of that ugly mug and we can go to the next slide. So thanks. And I'll make this quick so we do allow that time here for public comment as well. But we've had quite a few comments in the chat box over the last few meetings about what's going on at the federal level. So I wanted to give a quick update, very quick, but again, good afternoon. I'm just going to take a couple quick minutes to hit at the highest level, the various efforts that are currently underway. Again, at the federal level regarding infrastructure funding, there's several things that are going on. It'll include a quick overview of President Biden's American Jobs Plan, the reauthorization of the FAST Act, and some of the things that we as an organization at PennDOT have been doing to communicate and coordinate at the federal level. Next slide, Paul. So as you can see, I'm not going to read through these. I'll just highlight the jobs plan was announced March 31st of 2021. You can see the numbers there. I will say that those numbers were the numbers when the jobs plan was initially announced. There's been a lot of negotiation since March 31st and June 14th. So stay tuned. As it was originally put forth, it was a proposal of 8-year program, approximately 35% increase. At the federal level, I will note that you look at 35% and that sounds like, wow, that's a lot. But last time we've seen a significant increase, and we've heard this a few times over with this group, at the federal level was 1993. So if you look at inflation and the rate of inflation over those years, 35% doesn't really quite get us to above the level. The saga here that continues really is what's going to come out at the end of this, if anything. Over the last couple of weeks, there's been a few steps forward, and then there was a step backwards midweek last week. And then after that, I'd say another step or two forward as we sort of closed out last week. On Tuesday evening, which would have been June 8th, the White House announced that it was calling off all negotiations with the Senate Republicans. Repeated talks at the meetings had narrowed the gap between what the president's initial plan was and what the Senate proposal was. But the two sides were still pretty far apart, and they had some major differences that they really couldn't overcome. And those differences included the definition of infrastructure, this total size and the cost of it. And oh, by the way, the one big thing, how do you fund it? So at the midweek last week, the White House did turn its attention to working with a bipartisan group of 20 individual senators to see if a deal could be reached. It seemed a bit more promising as of Friday evening. In fact, it seemed like there was an announcement of a negotiation there and the job reached. So again, we'll see what shakes out there. Stay tuned. If it doesn't reach an agreement, they still may push forward, they be in the White House, on trying to get the Senate to go through what's called a reconciliation process, which only requires 50 votes. So stay tuned is the key word there. Stay tuned on a lot of this, I'd say. There's a lot of sausage making that needs to happen in the next few months here. Next slide, Paul. So FAST Act reauthorization, next couple slides will deal with that. We know that the FAST Act expired last September. We also know that Congress passed a one-year extension, which takes us to September 30th of 2021. Both the Senate and the House continue to work on reauthorization legislation. The Senate Environment and Public Works Committee did mark up their legislation on May 26th, and on a unanimous 20-0 bipartisan vote, pushed it out of the Environment and Public Works Committee. I will say that the Environment and Public Works Committee, their portion of a reauthorization bill is the highway, the bridge, and the safety component of infrastructure. The House bill, while I had in here, hasn't been marked up yet as of 6/9. Well, that, as I said, things are fluid. So between when I had to have my slides to Paul and today, actually the end of last week, things have changed there. So I'll hit on that in a few slides. The other real news here on the Senate side, maybe we can bump to the next slide, Paul. We'll buzz through that.
Okay.
So again, I'm going to hit on what the Senate's doing and what the House is doing. I mentioned the 20-0 bipartisan vote from the Environment and Public Works Committee. So that brings forward a highway, a bridge, and a safety component of a reauthorization bill. Within that, there was $303.5 billion over a 5-year period, so 2022 through 2026 for the highway, bridge, and safety program. And that's roughly, depending how you look at it, based on the press releases, they say a 34% increase over the FAST Act. I say it's more in the mid to upper 20s because of some of the discretionary programs that come right off the top. If you look at what Pennsylvania's share is, it's really an estimate. Please don't quote me on this, because again, there's a lot of things that can change, but about 11.3 billion over that 5-year period. Some of the next steps, there's various committees that have jurisdiction. And again, this is sort of late breaking news as of Friday evening, in that the Senate Commerce Committee did release their Surface Transportation Investment Act. And this authorizes titles which cover multimodal, rail, highway, vehicle motor carrier safety, research, and hazmat as well. And that'll be combined with the Environment and Public Works bill that came out, as I mentioned, May 26th. So again, the Commerce Committee, which oversees the multimodal, the rail, the highway, vehicle motor carrier safety, as well as the research and hazmat, they have come out with a draft. They're anticipating to do a markup of their bill on this Wednesday, so June 16th. So stay tuned. With any luck, they'll get their markup in before the end of the week, and we'll see some better numbers and more solid numbers for the other components that make up our overall infrastructure. Next slide. So what's going on at the House? You can see there the House legislation that's recently come out. I'm going to just hit on the highway real quick. $343 billion over 5 years for the highway, bridge, and safety program. Pretty similar numbers as far as the overall share that Pennsylvania would see, about $11.57 billion over the 5 years. Obviously, there's some more work that has to be done on their various committees as well. But I will say the House Transportation and Infrastructure, their version of the multi-year authorization bill really was essentially just a reauthorization of the FAST Act. And that process, they started their markup of the bill June 9th, so midweek last week. And it went for about 10 hours. The committee got through 29 amendments out of about 230. So as you can imagine, that's not much. And only 2 of the minor amendments were adopted during that 10 hours. They kept moving on, and they went into the wee hours of the morning, and I think it's 5 or 6 a.m. Thursday morning, the 10th. The markup was complete, so they did about 17 hours of markup. And in fact, put a bill through. So they approved their bill. And while I highlighted the roads and bridge number there, I do want to hit on, so that 343 billion is about 63% of the total funding. The total bill equates to 547 billion. So again, 63% for the highway over the 5 years. Public transit, about 109 billion. Again, not on the slide, but I'll give you the numbers. That's about 20% of the overall bill. And then 95 billion for passenger rail and freight rail. So again, you add the 95 billion for passenger and freight rail, 109 billion for transit, and the 343 billion for highway, bridge, and safety. That gets you to the total package of 547 billion. I will say, obviously, there's a lot that has to happen here too. And working through the committees, we'll see what comes out at the end. Couple things that are in here that probably are of note. The one significant one that comes out, it's sort of saying states must spend no less than 20% of their two largest apportioned programs on bridge repair or rehab. And for some reason, replacement's not included in that. So again, there's a lot of things that have to happen. We'll see what shakes out in the end. The good news is there's a lot of discussion at the federal level. There appears to be an appetite, at least for some sort of an increase. So anything more than what we have today is better than what we have today. And then if we can go to the last slide, I'll wrap us up, Paul. So just on the communication, we've been seeing some of that in the chat as well, and what we've been doing at the local level with the reauthorization process really in full swing. Earmarks made a comeback for the first time in probably over a decade. As that guidance became a little clearer, we quickly worked with our MPOs and our RPOs to share guidance, develop a proposed process for identifying and submitting what I would say are good earmark projects. So we're optimistic that the guidance will pay off with projects that are successful in obtaining earmark funds, and hopefully deliverable in a very timely fashion, because they were to be projects that were already on a transportation improvement program. At the state level, through outreach to other state DOTs, through AASHTO's efforts, AASHTO very early on established 5 core principles for consideration as the FAST Act reauthorization talks began in earnest, I'd say early last calendar year, so early 2020. Those 5 principles included a timely reauthorization bill and ensuring that it was long-term, enacting that long-term sustainable revenue solution to the Highway Trust Fund, increasing and prioritizing the formula-based funding to the states so that most of it gets distributed to the states through formula, increasing states' overall flexibility, reducing program burdens, and improving project delivery. And then lastly, support to ensure that the states have the ability to harness innovation and technology. And as you can see in some of the things that have been put out with the early drafts in the Senate and the House reauthorization bills, AASHTO's core policies and principles have been spread throughout both the Senate and House bills. And then at the federal level, just quickly, PennDOT established early and frequent communication with our congressional delegation as the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Our initial COVID-19 communications in the summer of 2020 focused on the revenue losses we were facing, as well as an emphasis on Congress taking up a reauthorization bill that considered AASHTO's 5 core principles that I had just mentioned. That communication continued through the end of 2020 and the first 6 months of this calendar year, 2021. And I will say, not to toot our own horn, but in fact, Pennsylvania is seeing quite a bit of national attention in that President Biden did announce the American Jobs Plan in Pittsburgh on March 31st, 2021. And that was followed up with a visit from Secretary Buttigieg and other congressional members in May to take a look at Pittsburgh's vast infrastructure needs. Again, not just roads, bridges, but also public transit, locks, dams, and everything that goes along with infrastructure in the Commonwealth. So again, I think that communication at all levels has led to us having a seat at the not the kids' table at Thanksgiving, but the grown-ups table at a national level, and we'll continue those efforts until we see a successful reauthorization of the FAST Act. And I think with that, Paul, hopefully I left you some time for public comment.
Thank you, Larry. You get to take a breath now. We appreciate that. So it is our opportunity for public comment. So members of the public who have joined us by telephone, who did not otherwise have the opportunity to give comments, can unmute. And we'll wait to see if we have any takers this time. Hearing none, I will point ahead to June 24. So Jenny Granger will be back with us. Jenny gave us an excellent presentation a couple of times back. So by popular demand, she's going to address kind of some implications of the package delivery fees, you know, what kinds of opportunities there are there, and then kind of a long line item here, but just to continue our work in parallel, as Keith pointed out earlier, of looking at what the final report may ultimately include in the way of proposals and some of that content that we can kind of get behind us now so that we can really finish strong during July with actually forming up some recommendations. So that's the outlook for next time around. Must mean we are close to the end of our time together, Secretary Gramian, and your time to sign off with our fine participants.
Okay, Paul, thank you. That was a another great meeting today. Thank you all for your engagement, great presentations, thoughtful comments. I commend this commission for the most open and transparent process and dialogues that have taken place. I really appreciate everyone's efforts and sharing your thoughts. As we move into the last 6 weeks of our time together, let's rally to advance a strategic proposal that makes a compelling case for bold, united action for multimodal transportation solution. Pennsylvania needs and deserves solution that will support transportation for future generations. And yes, Larry, it's great to be at the adults table for Thanksgiving dinner. I look forward to our work ahead. As always, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out directly to me or any member of our team. And thank you again, and looking forward to hear from you and see you in a couple of weeks.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Chair Gramey. And we will pull together the results of today's session, and we'll talk with the work group leads about what they might like to do between now and June 24th. We didn't want to make it a heavy lift in terms of an effort, but I think as Shauna pointed out, the spreadsheet really did serve its purpose to bring everything into the conversation, start to put some of those options into perspective. And it really is our job now to kind of turn that corner and make sure that some of those things can be formulated as recommendations that really make sense with the proper rationale. So that's kind of the outlook between now and then. We know we have a lot of work yet to do, but we have the commission to do it. So thank you all. Signing off from T-Rock Studios. We sure appreciate your participation.